On Good Friday 1296, the English crown destroyed the second wealthiest port in the British Isles. Berwick-upon-Tweed, a trading hub whose revenues rivaled those of London itself, ceased to exist as a functioning city in the space of a single day. Today, almost no trace of that medieval prosperity remains, and few remember it was ever there. This video uses artificial intelligence to reconstruct what Berwick looked like before that day and what followed. The images you will see are interpretive, built from archaeological evidence, contemporary descriptions, and historical records. Small inconsistencies may appear, but these tools allow us to walk through a vanished city with a precision that words alone cannot provide. What follows is the trajectory of a port that once dominated Anglo-Scottish trade. We begin with Berwick at the height of its Hanseatic prosperity, a royal burgh controlling wool exports to the Low Countries. Then the arrival of Edward Longshanks and the events of Good Friday. The decades of conflict that followed, as the town changed hands repeatedly through the wars of independence. Its reconstruction as an English garrison. And finally, the near-total erasure of its Scottish past from collective memory. In the 12th century, the Scottish crown transformed a border settlement into the principal royal port of the kingdom. David I granted Berwick-upon-Tweed its status as a royal burgh sometime between 1124 and 1153, establishing what would become the administrative heart of Berwickshire and the engine of Scotland's overseas commerce. By 1153, the town possessed its own mint, striking silver pennies that circulated across northern Europe, and its harbour welcomed merchant ships from the Baltic to the Low Countries. The prosperity that followed exceeded anything north of London. Flemish traders established the Red Hall, German merchants operated from the White Hall, and 13 religious houses maintained warehouses along the Tweed's quays. Scottish wool moved through Berwick's docks in quantities that made the town indispensable to the Hanseatic League's northern network, whilst timber, salted fish and hides filled the holds of vessels bound for Flanders, the German ports and Scandinavia. Contemporary records describe the harbour crowded with foreign ships during trading season, their crews speaking Low German, Flemish and Norse, alongside Scots and English. By the mid-13th century, Berwick rivaled the greatest commercial centres of Britain. One estimate placed the population between 12 and 15,000, making it amongst the 5 largest settlements in England and Scotland combined. The wealth this generated prompted comparisons that revealed the town's stature. Alexander III of Scotland observed that as Aberdeen stood to Berwick, so Berwick stood to London, a measurement suggesting that Scotland's premier port operated at a scale approaching the English capital itself. William Eddington, Bishop and Chancellor, later called Berwick another Alexandria, whose riches were the sea and whose walls were the water, a reference to the classical trading hub whose name stood for commercial supremacy. This prosperity rested on geography and royal favour in equal measure. The Tweed provided sheltered anchorage and access to the wool-producing hinterlands of the Scottish borders, whilst successive kings granted charters that attracted foreign merchants and secured favourable trading terms. By 1290, when Edward I arrived to arbitrate the succession between John Balliol and Robert Bruce at Berwick Castle, the town stood as the wealthiest settlement in Scotland and one of the richest ports in the British Isles. On the 19th of March, 1286, a storm swept across the Firth of Forth as Alexander III of Scotland rode from Edinburgh towards his young queen at Kinghorn. The horse stumbled in darkness along the coastal cliffs, and by morning the king lay dead on the shore below. With him fell the stability of the Scottish kingdom. His sole surviving heir, a 3-year-old granddaughter in Norway, died 4 years later during the voyage to claim her throne, leaving Scotland without clear succession for the first time in 2 centuries. 13 claimants emerged, the strongest amongst them John Balliol of Annandale and Robert Bruce of Carrick. Unable to resolve the succession internally, the Scottish magnates invited Edward I of England to arbitrate in 1291. Edward agreed, but demanded prior acknowledgement of English overlordship. The Scots accepted reluctantly, and in November 1292, Edward chose Balliol, who seemed the weaker candidate and therefore easier to control. The calculation proved deliberate. Within months, Edward summoned Balliol to Westminster to answer appeals against Scottish court judgments, treating the crowned king as a subordinate official. When Edward demanded Scottish military service for his French campaigns in 1294, Balliol's nobles refused. On the 23rd of October 1295, Scottish envoys signed a mutual defence treaty with France at Paris. The Old Alliance, as it became known, represented direct defiance of English authority, binding Scotland to support France against any aggressor. Edward interpreted the agreement as rebellion. He summoned Balliol to Berwick in 1296 to answer for treason, confiscated estates held by Scottish nobles in England, and ordered military preparations on a scale not seen for a generation. By late March 1296, 25,000 English troops had assembled at Newcastle under Edward's personal command. The heavy cavalry, Flemish crossbowmen, and Welsh infantry represented the largest invasion force ever directed at Scotland. Berwick stood 75 miles north, prosperously undefended, its wealth undiminished by the constitutional crisis unfolding around it. The port that had enriched 3 kings now stood directly in the path of the 4th, and Edward had no intention of negotiation. On the morning of the 30th of March 1296, Edward the First of England brought his army across the Tweed and positioned it before the defences of Berwick-upon-Tweed. The town that had generated customs revenue, second only to London, stood protected by wooden palisades, an earthwork rampart, and a shallow ditch running along the landward perimeter. No stone fortification enclosed the burg. The merchants and burgesses who controlled the town had long depended upon commercial treaty, upon the network of Hanseatic protection that shielded ports across the North Sea trading sphere, and upon the assumption that England would not willingly destroy a revenue stream it had historically claimed for itself during periods of occupation. That assumption proved catastrophic. As Edward's forces assembled in the pale dawn, townsmen lined the walls and mocked the English deployment. Chronicles record the taunt hurled across the ditch. "King Edward, with the long shanks, hath caught his pranks." The merchants appear to have believed, even at this late hour, that the commercial value of the port would impose restraint, that the king who had received homage from Scottish nobles within these very walls during earlier submissions would hesitate before damaging the infrastructure of trade. Edward attended a field mass for Good Friday, observed the liturgy commemorating the crucifixion, and then gave the order. The assault began shortly after the conclusion of the religious service. English forces struck the palisade line at multiple points, whilst a naval contingent moved upriver to cut off retreat by water. The wooden gates, built to regulate commerce rather than withstand siege engines, gave way under sustained pressure within the first hours. Soldiers poured through the breaches and into the street grid, where wool bales still sat stacked in warehouses along the quayside, where Flemish factors maintained their counting houses, and where Scottish, Hanseatic and Italian merchants conducted the ordinary business of a March morning. The truce implicit in commercial interdependence ended in the space of those hours. The wealthiest port in Scotland, a town whose customs revenues had funded royal ambitions for more than a century, passed into English hands amidst circumstances that would define Berwick's identity for the remainder of its existence. The English assault opened before midday, concentrated on the eastern palisade where the defences stood weakest. Flemish and German merchants holding sections of the wall engaged the first English troops, killing 30 mounted knights in close fighting along the timber ramparts. Edward, observing from elevated ground south of the Tweed, gave the order for general assault across the entire perimeter. What followed lasted 2 days. The chronicler Walter of Guisborough, writing within a decade of the event, recorded that rivers of blood ran through the streets from Good Friday morning through the following day. The Lanercost Chronicle, compiled at a priory 60 miles south, corroborated the account with similar language. English forces moved through the merchant quarter, the guild halls, the warehouses that lined the harbour frontage, and the residential streets that climbed inland from the port. The town that had generated customs revenues approaching a quarter of the English crown's income ceased to function as a mercantile centre within hours. At the Red Hall, a stone structure near the centre of the burg, 30 Flemish merchants barricaded themselves inside and refused surrender. English troops surrounded the building and set fire to the structure. Contemporary accounts record that all 30 perished in the flames. The hall had served as a meeting place for the Flemish trading community that had operated continuously in Berwick, Berwick-upon-Tweed for more than a century. The killing continued through the night and resumed at dawn on the 31st of March. Medieval chroniclers, writing in monastic scriptoria with access to eyewitness accounts, provided estimates ranging from 7,500 to 17,000 dead. Modern historians regard the lower figure as credible given the town's documented population and economic scale. What remains undisputed is that Berwick-upon-Tweed, the second city of Scotland, lost effectively its entire resident population across 48 hours. The massacre ended when Edward witnessed the killing of a pregnant woman in the street and commanded his forces to cease. By that point, the merchant families, the guild craftsmen, the Flemish factors, the German traders, the Scottish burgesses, who had negotiated trading privileges across the North Sea and Baltic ports, had been eliminated. The warehouses stood empty or burned. The ships at anchor in the harbour served no remaining commercial function. If reconstructing events like this matters to you, consider becoming a channel member. Your support allows the careful research and visualization that documenting these moments requires. We will now turn to what Edward constructed upon the ruins. Edward thus returned to Berwick-upon-Tweed in August 1296, 4 months after the slaughter, to receive homage from approximately 2,000 Scottish nobles defeated at Dunbar and assembled under English occupation. The town that had rivalled London in customs revenue now served a singular military function, and construction gangs began raising stone fortifications across ground still marked by violence. By 1318, massive curtain walls enclosed a garrison town built to hold the northern frontier, their circuit defining Berwick's new identity as an English military stronghold positioned against the kingdom it had once enriched. The port's transformation from Hanseatic hub to forward fortress triggered consequences that extended far beyond the Tweed estuary. In May 1297, barely a year after Edward received Scottish submission at Berwick, William Wallace killed the English sheriff of Lanark, initiating the armed resistance that became the Wars of Independence. On the 23rd of August 1305, an arm severed from Wallace's quartered body arrived at Berwick for public display, a warning mounted on the walls Edward had ordered built. In June 1314, Edward II assembled 25,000 troops at the garrison before marching to catastrophic defeat at Bannockburn, demonstrating that control of Berwick alone could not secure Scotland. The town changed hands 13 times between 1296 and 1482, each transfer marking shifts in the wider conflict. Scottish forces supported by Flemish and German privateers besieged Berwick from 1315 to 1318, recapturing it in April. England retook the garrison the day after victory at Hallidawn Hill in 1333. Scots briefly held the town, though not the castle, following a siege in November 1355, losing it again 2 months later. In 1461, during England's Wars of the Roses, Margaret of Anjou ceded Berwick back to Scotland in exchange for military support against Yorkist forces, and Robert Lauder of E.D. Rington commanded the castle as Scottish keeper. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, secured Berwick for England permanently in 1482, though Scotland disputed English possession in royal charters for 2 centuries thereafter. The stone walls raised after the 1296 massacre still mark portions of the modern town, monuments to the garrison function that replaced a trading port and defined Berwick's role across nearly 200 years of sustained warfare. The port that generated customs revenues rivaling London's became, across 7 centuries of English chronicle, a frontier town of marginal significance. This transformation in historical memory did not occur by accident, but through systematic erasure of Berwick-upon-Tweed's Scottish commercial identity from the narratives that shaped British understanding of the medieval past. English sources written after 1482, when Richard III secured the town's final return to the crown, progressively diminished Berwick's earlier role as Scotland's premier trading hub. The Hanseatic ties, the Flemish merchants, the customs revenues that had once matched those of London. These facts receded from chronicle and commentary. What remained was a border fortress, contested ground in wars, whose economic origins became secondary to territorial narrative. By the 16th century, the town appeared in English accounts primarily as military infrastructure, its wealth before 1296 rendered invisible. The pattern held across subsequent centuries. whilst the massacres at Drogheda, or the Highland clearances, entered popular historical consciousness through repeated telling, the slaughter of March 1296 remained absent from English education, mentioned briefly, if at all, in accounts of the Wars of Independence. The disparity reveals itself starkly through comparison. Had Edward thus destroyed London, rather than Berwick, on Good Friday 1296, the event would anchor every curriculum. Instead, the destruction of Scotland's wealthiest port disappeared into footnote status, its victims uncounted in the broader historical memory that shaped British identity after the Union. Scottish nationalism itself contributed little to Berwick's recovery. Walter Scott's 19th century historical romances popularised Wallace and Bruce, Bannock Byrne and Culloden. Yet Berwick, the originating catastrophe of the independence wars, remained marginal to the nation-building narratives that followed. The Scottish diaspora across 5 continents learned the names of defeats and victories, but not the port whose destruction preceded them all. That Berwick-upon-Tweed stands today as England's northernmost town. Its medieval Scottish identity, unknown to most who pass through, represents the culmination of this process. 700 years of chronicle and curriculum transformed the kingdom's second port into a border settlement, its importance erased not through single decree, but through generations of selective remembering. The town that once rivaled London became a place most Britons could not locate on a map, its wealth and slaughter equally forgotten. Berwick-upon-Tweed stands today as England's northernmost town, positioned 2.5 miles south of the Scottish border, with a population recorded at 12,043. The stone walls, whose construction began in 1296 and was completed by 1318, remain substantially intact, open to visitors who walk circuits unaware that the defences replaced a timber palisade breached on Good Friday 7 centuries past. No monument marks the slaughter that claimed between 4,000 and 15,000 lives, nor the port that once generated customs revenues rivalling London's. The medieval harbour has vanished entirely, replaced by Victorian infrastructure and a modest fishing quay. The Flemish and German trading houses, the warehouses stacked with wool and hides, the counting rooms of Italian banking agents, all reduced to archival fragments and contested chronicles. A town that drew merchants from Lubeck and Florence persists as a name on a map, its identity divided amongst those who call themselves English, Scottish, or simply Berwickers, guarded by the stone ghosts of a Hanseatic prosperity that Edward Plantagenet destroyed in 2 days and erased across 700 years.